Mr. Speaker, on the expenditure front, total expenditure including arrears clearance for the period was broadly contained within budgetary constraints and amounted to 59.3 billion, 19.7% of GDP, against a target of 60 billion, 20.1% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, given the developments in revenue and expenditure, the overall budget balance registered a deficit of 11.7 billion, or 3.9% of GDP, compared to the target of 3.7% of GDP. The deficit was financed from both domestic and external sources. Total domestic financing amounted to 8.9 billion, equivalent to 3% of GDP, and constituted 84% of total financing. Foreign financing amounted to 2.7 billion, equivalent to 0.9% of GDP, against a target of 4.7 billion, or 1.6% of GDP. The primary balance recorded a surplus of 4.1 billion, equivalent to 1.4% of GDP, compared to the targeted surplus of 4.2 billion, which is also 1.4% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, in line with our fiscal operations, Ghana's gross public debt stock in nominal terms stood at 173.1 billion, or $35.9 billion at the end of 2018. This was made up of 86.2 billion, or 17.9 billion of external debt, and 86.9 billion, or 18 billion of domestic debt. Mr. Speaker, government in 2018 implemented a liability management program focusing on actively managing the public debt portfolio and minimizing refinancing risk in line with the approved debt strategy. Leveraging on an improved macroeconomic environment, government earmarked a total amount of $1.25 billion from the proceeds of the 2018 Eurobond of 2 billion for its liability management program as follows. 830 million was used to buy back part of the 2022 Eurobond. This was also the largest liability management exercise by Ghana to date. Buybacks totaling 309 million Ghana cedis were conducted to help smoothen the maturity profile of public domestic debt and reduce refinancing risk. And the maturing 2-year domestic US dollar-denominated bond of 94.6 million was fully redeemed, Mr. Speaker. Government also spent 300 million to generate liquidity on the secondary market by buying back some domestic bonds. Consequently, the tenor of the domestic debt was extended to the longer end with an amount of 4.2 billion. Mr. Speaker, I now report on the macroeconomic performance for the first half of 2019. The following macroeconomic targets were set for 2019. Overall real GDP growth of 7.6%, non-oil real GDP growth rate of 6.2%, end period inflation of 8%, overall fiscal deficit of 4.2% of GDP, primary surplus of 1.2% of GDP, and gross international reserve to cover at least 3.5 months of imports. Mr. Speaker, provisional estimates released by the Ghana Statistical Services in April 2019 show that overall real GDP growth recorded a growth rate of 6.7% in the first quarter 2019 compared to 5.4% over the same period in 2018. Growth in the non-oil sector was 6% compared to 4.2% in the corresponding period of 2018. The industry sector recorded a growth rate of 8.4% in the first quarter of 2019 compared to 10.4% during the same period in 2018. Growth in the services sector rebounded strongly to 7.2% in the first quarter of 2019 compared to 1.4% recorded during the same period of 2018, while the agri sector reduced the lowest growth of 2.2% first quarter 2019 compared to 4.7% during the same period in 2018. Mr. Speaker, in spite of the progress made to contain inflationary pressures over the past 24 months, headline inflation rose gradually from 9% in January to 9.5% in April, reflecting pass-through effects of the currency depreciation during the period. Inflation, however, declined gradually to 9.4% in May and further to 9.1% in June 2019. In line with the disinflation process, the Bank of Ghana policy rate was further reduced by 100 basis points to 16% in January 2019 and has since remained unchanged. Over the first half, the 91-day Treasury bill rate rose to 14.8% in June 2019 from 14.6% in December 2018. Similarly, the rate on the 182-day bills also increased to 15.2% from 15% for the comparative period. Mr. Speaker, the recapitalization exercise undertaken by Bank of Ghana, which sought to increase the stated minimum capital of banks from 120 million to 400 million, ended in December 2018 with a total of 23 banks meeting the requirements. Following the cleanup exercise, total assets of the banking sector increased by over 12% between June 2018 and June 2019. Total deposits also increased by over 22% during this period. With the rebound of the sector, banks are now poised to deploy their newly injected capital towards financial intermediation to aid the development process. Asset quality has also improved, as reflected in the declining non-performing loans ratio from 22.6% in June 2018 to 18.1% June 2019. There was also significant improvements in the bank's profitability indicators. Mr. Speaker, on the external front, provisional trade balance for the first half of 2019 show an improved trade surplus of 2.8% of GDP compared to a surplus of 1.9% of GDP in the first half of 2018. As a result, the current account recorded a marginal surplus in the first half of 2019, the first in recent times. Coupled with the significant inflows recorded by the capital and financial accounts, the overall balance of payment yielded, Mr. Speaker, a surplus of 1.9% of GDP over the review period, compared with a deficit of 0.6% of GDP recorded during the same period last year. The positive development in the external sector contributed significantly to improvements in the stock of gross international reserves to 9.9 billion at end March 2019, enough to pay for over 5 months of import of goods and services before declining to 4.3 months import cover at the end of June 2019, largely on account of energy-related debt payments and higher repatriation obligations occasioned by domestic debt interest and coupon repayments to non-resident domestic debt holders. Mr. Speaker, after experiencing some temporary pressures in February 2019, the Ghana cedi largely stabilized towards the end of the first quarter of 2019 on account of improved supply of foreign exchange, partly from the recent Eurobond issue. The cedi experienced a cumulative depreciation of 8.4% in the year to June 2019, compared to 2.4% for the corresponding period of 2018. Against the pound sterling and the euro, the cedi cumulatively depreciated by 7.6% and 7.9% respectively. Mr. Speaker, provisional fiscal data for the first half of 2019 showed that revenue mobilization fell short of target due mainly to shortfalls in customs receipts and non-oil, non-tax revenues. Although expenditures were broadly within target, the pace of execution was faster due mainly to the need to accommodate some armed program and expenses on regional border security. Mr. Speaker, these developments pushed our financing requirements above the program limits for the period to enable us to address these additional expenditure pressures. Consequently, the fiscal deficit for the period widened from a target of 2.9% of GDP to 3.3%. Mr. Speaker, total revenue and grants for the first half of the year amounted to 22.8 compared to the program target of 27 billion, resulting in a shortfall of 15.5%. This, however, represents a nominal increase of 7.8% over the corresponding period in 2018. Though 9.4% below target for the first half of 2019, represents an annual increase of 14.7%, with the exception of domestic VAT, petroleum excise taxes, domestic national health insurance levy, and GET fund levy, all of which outperformed their respective targets for the period. Most revenue lines underperformed their respective targets for the period, but are expected to recover in the second half of the year. Mr. Speaker, total expenditures, including arrears clearance, amounted to $34.2 billion for the period compared to the program target of $36.8 billion. Mr. Speaker, key expenditures were well contained during the period, with the exception of expenses on the use of goods and services, which was 30.1% higher than target, mainly on account of security-related expenses to reinforce our borders. So far, expenses on the Free SHS program and some other government flagship programs have remained on track. Mr. Speaker, government's fiscal operations resulted in a cash deficit of 3.3% of GDP compared with a program target of 2.9% of GDP for the half year. Mr. Speaker, a significant portion of the deficit was financed from foreign sources at 1.3%, including proceeds from the 2019 Eurobond issuance, which raised a total of $3 billion in 7-year, 12-year, and 31-year Eurobonds of $750 million, $1.25 billion, and $1 billion respectively. Domestic financing of the deficit, including market operation, constituted a remaining 18.7%. The primary balance recorded a deficit equivalent to 0.8% of GDP against a deficit target of 0.1% of GDP for the period. Mr. Speaker, the gross public debt stock in nominal terms stood at $204 billion as at end of June 2019, representing 59.2% of GDP. The increase was mainly as a result of front-loading the financing requirements for 2019 in the first quarter. Debt accumulation in the subsequent quarters is expected to ease downwards and stabilize. The share of the external debt stock increased from 50.2% at end December 2018 to 52.8% at the end of June 2019, mainly driven by the issuance of Eurobonds of $3 billion in March. The IMF also disbursed an amount of SDR 132.4 million SDRs, equivalent to $184.3 million US dollars. In March 2019, after their 7th and 8th reviews of the Extended Credit Facility Program. On account of these two major inflows, a net amount of $2.9 billion US dollars, equivalent to approximately $14.8 billion, was added to the debt stock. The increase in the external debt stock amounted to $23.8 billion between December 2018 and June 2019, reflecting a volume transaction of $14.8 billion and exchange rate depreciation of 9 billion Ghana cedis. Mr. Speaker, in line with the approval of this August House, government did raise a total of $3 billion in the 7, 12-year and 31-year Eurobonds of $750 billion, $1.25 billion, and $1 billion respectively. The 7-year, 12-year, and 31-year bonds were priced at 7.6875%, 8.125%, and 8.950% respectively. The 2019 Eurobond issue was significant in two respects, Mr. Speaker. It was the first ever triple tranche Eurobond offering by Ghana and also the largest by sub-Saharan Africa country, excluding South Africa, and the largest and the longest maturity of 31 years in Africa as we trend forward towards our century bond. We have observed new trends in macroeconomic aggregates which pose fiscal risk and threaten to derail our fiscal efforts if necessary corrective policy measures are not timely applied. Mr. Speaker, among other things, the following developments have warranted a revision to the 2019 macroeconomic framework. Relatively weak performance of the Ghana cedi against the US dollar, driven largely by external pressures, especially in the first quarter of 2019. The Ghana cedi depreciated cumulatively by 8.4% through end June 2019. Lower than program total revenue and grants, faster rate of expenditure execution of 92.2% relative to a revenue mobilization performance rate of 84.5% for the first half year of 2019. Crystallization of energy sector related contingent liabilities which were not programmed into the 2019 budget and expenditures on regional security related concerns, and lower than projected crude oil and gas volumes. Mr. Speaker, in view of these developments and consistent with Section 28(2)(d) of Act 921, the 2019 GDP projections, as well as the 2019 fiscal framework, has been revised to safeguard our public finances. Real GDP growth rate has been revised downwards from 7.6% to 7.1% on the back of a relatively larger GDP base for 2018, as well as the lower projected crude oil and gas volumes. Mr. Speaker, to enable government to take precautionary measures in response to emerging regional security concerns arising from developments in the region, the fiscal framework has been recalibrated to accommodate an overall budget deficit equivalent to 4.5% of GDP. This is 0.3 percentage points higher than the fiscal deficit target of 4.2% of GDP approved previously in November 2018 by honorable members. Mr. Speaker, this still remains responsibly below the 5% ceiling we have legally set for ourselves, and we intend to honor it. Mr. Speaker, this notwithstanding, the fiscal outlook for the remaining half of the year remains sound, even in the midst of strong domestic headwinds. The revised 2019 fiscal framework has carefully considered some measures in the second half of the year to safeguard the revised deficit target of 4.5% of GDP. We are therefore confident that the implementation of these fiscal measures will enable government to contain the fiscal deficit within the Fiscal Responsibility Act threshold of 5% of GDP. The fiscal measures are specifically geared towards improving domestic revenue mobilization, reining in expenditures, as well as addressing some critical protracted structural issues in the energy sector. Financing of the fiscal deficit for the second half of the year will be a balanced blend of foreign and domestic financing resources. Expectations are that a World Bank Development Policy Operation Facility, DPO, estimated at $500 million, an increase from $250 million, will be approved by this August House for disbursement in the second half of the year. Domestic financing is expected to moderate in the second half of the year, given the sizable front-loading of financing requirements in the first half of the year, which were funded from this source. Proceeds from the monetization of mineral royalties is also expected to moderate domestic borrowing in the second half. Mr. Speaker, the revised total revenue and grants is $58.9 billion, 0.01 percentage point lower than the original 2019 budget estimate of $58.9049 billion. Of this amount, non-oil tax revenue projected at $43.1 billion and is expected to be boosted by stronger performance from higher corporate income taxes, petroleum excise taxes, and domestic VAT in the second half of the year. The effect of the reduction in the benchmark import values, which became effective from April 2019, will be mitigated by enhanced trade tax compliance following the introduction of additional efficiency measures at the ports, including operations by MPS Limited. Non-tax revenues are expected to be enhanced by the proceeds from the sale of electromagnetic spectrum, as well as fees from the renewal of telcos. Mr. Speaker, total expenditures, including arrears clearance for the year, is now estimated to be $74.6 billion, about 1.6% higher than the 2019 budget estimate of $73.4 billion. Upward adjustments to interest payments reflect partly the effect of a higher exchange rate than programmed, as well as higher net domestic borrowings to meet some regional emergency security and energy expenses in the first half of the year. Additionally, upward adjustment in projected expenditures for goods and services are to meet critical expenses on security, among others. Mr. Speaker, the revised overall budget deficit is therefore programmed at 4.5% of GDP. This deficit target is consistent with our debt sustainability analysis for 2019 and the medium term. The estimated World Bank DPO facility of $500 million and the proceeds from the monetization of mineral royalties are expected to moderate domestic borrowing in the second half of the year. Mr. Speaker, the crystallization of energy sector contingent liabilities in respect of take-or-pay contract obligations of independent power producers, estimated at $5.1 billion for 2019, is being amortized, thus increasing the requirements for external amortization above the amount originally provisioned for in the 2019 budget. Mr. Speaker, as a result of these revisions to the 2019 fiscal framework, the 2019 appropriation of $78,771,833,602.12 cedis that was approved by this August House in November 2018 will not be adequate to cater for the additional program needs, which would increase the total appropriation to $85,142,189,527.4 cedis. Government is therefore requesting honorable members to consider and approve an amount of $6,370,355,925.82 million cedis as supplementary estimates to the original appropriation of $78,771,833,602.12 million to bring the revised total appropriation for the 2019 fiscal year to 85.1 billion Ghana cedis. Mr. Speaker, consistent with Article 179(8) of the Constitution, the request for a supplementary estimate is necessitated by additional precautionary expenditures in response to regional security developments and the amortization of contingent liabilities associated with take-or-pay contracts in the energy sector which have crystallized. Mr. Speaker, revenue measures, including the sale of an electromagnetic spectrum, telco license renewal, gains to be derived from the realization of assets and mineral rights, and strengthening of compliance at the ports and others, are being pursued vigorously to ensure that the revised domestic revenue target for 2019, which is some $8.3 billion below the original budget projection, is not compromised. Mr. Speaker, as part of government's resolve to ensure that the 2019 budget is implemented as planned, the following additional revenue measures are being proposed for the consideration and approval by honorable members. Energy sector levies. The Energy Sector Levies Act 2015, Act 899, restructured, rationalized, and consolidated all the revenue legislation relating to the energy sector into one law. The object was to dedicate the levies to the energy sector and to promote prudent and efficient utilization of the revenue, as well as facilitate sustainable long-term investments in the energy sector to enhance availability, regularity, and reliability of supply. The dedication of these consolidated levies was to improve the poor balance sheets of the power sector utilities, and relieve government of the pressures of the sector in terms of reduced reliance on Ministry of Finance occasional direct funding. The sector, however, continues to be exposed due to the recurring debts and the inherited take-or-pay contracts. At the inception of the Act, it was estimated that approximately 24% of the expand price of fuel will adequately cover the required financing. This percentage has dwindled over the years and is currently about 17% due to inflation. We have noted suggestions from the general public on the implementation of this tax, and Mr. Speaker, as a listening government, we are proposing to the House the withdrawal of the luxury tax levy. Continue. We will, Mr. Speaker, continue to improve compliance.
All decided no placards. I'm reminding you gently, which of course reflects also in our standing orders. If you don't remember, I'm reminding you. And we shall go by our own understandings. Honorable, will you please go?
We will, Mr. Speaker, continue to improve compliance, expand the tax nets, and explore other innovative sources of raising revenue. Mr. Speaker, on the energy sector, I am happy to reaffirm that Dumsor is history. And we are, Mr. Speaker, determined to ensure that it remains that way. However, we are facing serious challenges in the energy sector that, Mr. Speaker, pose grave financial risk to the whole economy. At the heart of these challenges, Mr. Speaker, are the obnoxious take-or-pay contracts signed by the NDC, which obligate us to pay for capacity we do not need. We must urgently, Mr. Speaker, address these challenges to protect the hard-earned economic gains we have made in the past 2.5 years and continue with our economic growth and job agenda to improve the lives of Ghanaians. Mr. Speaker, this supplementary budget therefore proposes a number of bold measures to confront the issues to ensure that the energy sector delivers the services required by Ghanaians while maintaining financial viability. To be specific, Mr. Speaker, the two main issues confronting the sector are, firstly, the excess electricity generation which was procured during the NDC regime from independent power producers, including emergency power producers, at exorbitant prices under flawed take-or-pay contracts. Currently, according to the Energy Commission, the country has installed power generation capacity of 5,083 megawatts, dependable capacity of 4,593 megawatts, and peak demand, Mr. Speaker, of around 2,700 megawatts. So, Mr. Speaker, our installed capacity is almost double our peak demand. Notably, 2,300 megawatts of the installed capacity has been contracted on a take-or-pay basis. On average, Mr. Speaker, less than 40% of the contracted take-or-pay capacity is actually used, meaning that we are basically throwing away money by paying for the remaining 60% of excess capacity, which we do not actually consume. In monetary terms, what this means is that we are paying over $500 million US, or over 2.5 billion Ghana cedis annually for power generation capacity that we do not need. Regarding gas, Ghana has contracted for around 750 million scf per day by 2023. Current demand is around 250 million scf per day, and this is projected to rise to between 450 and 550 million scf per day by 2023. All things being equal, there is projected oversupply of 200 to 300 million scf per day by 2023. About 640 million scf a day of the contracted gas supply is on take-or-pay basis, meaning we have again to pay whether we use it or not. From 2020, we will be facing annual excess gas capacity charges of between 550 million and 850 million each year. Currently, for Sankofa Offshore Cape 3 Points gas alone, Mr. Speaker, we pay $51 million a month under a take-or-pay contract for 154 million scf per day, even though we only take 60 million scf per day on average. Additionally, there are still other challenges in the energy sector, including electricity tariffs that do not cover the cost of non-portfolio power purchase agreements, low collection, high technical and commercial losses, absence of a proper system for measuring and paying for the cost of power for street lighting, non-payment of utility bills by MDAs, and a high level of net sector arrears of 2.7 billion as of January 2019. Mr. Speaker, the total cost in the energy sector that government had to cover in 2018 amounted to $520 million. However, by end June this year, government had made total payments of $604 million US, equivalent to Ghana 3.14 billion. And if we do not urgently address the problems in the sector, the projected government payments in 2019 will be at least US $1 billion, 5.2 billion Ghana cedis. Our top technical experts, assisted by counterparts from the World Bank, have subjected the energy sector to a thorough analysis and produced the Energy Sector Reform Program, which identifies the key issues in the sector and proposes solutions. According to the ESRP, which has been approved by Cabinet, if we continue with business as usual in the energy sector, the cost to government will increase over time to an accumulated total of over $12.5 billion by 2023. Mr. Speaker, our macroeconomic stability and the hard-earned economic gains we have made are at serious risk of being derailed if we do not immediately take drastic steps to arrest these reprehensible legacy issues in the energy sector. Just to put this in context, the over $1 billion equivalent extraordinary payment that government is having to make in the energy sector this year and on an ongoing basis, if not addressed, is more than 2 times the amount of all government social expenditure on goods and services, which includes free SHS, our school feeding program, our LEAP program. It is no wonder, therefore, that the NDC was convinced that we could not fund President Akufo-Addo's free SHS program, but the Lord has found a way for this nation. Mr. Speaker, in addition, these wasteful expenditures in the energy sector are one of the main causes of increases in end-user electricity tariffs, imposing hardships on Ghanaians. Similarly, these tariffs makes Ghana uncompetitive for manufacturing, thus holding back our industrialization and job creation agenda. What is more, these wasteful payments are putting pressure on our foreign currency reserves and on the exchange rate. Mr. Speaker, in investment banking parlance, the NDC government's parting shot was an energy sector poison pill. But Mr. Speaker, we are determined that the good people of Ghana will not drink this hemlock. Mr. Speaker, We cannot allow this situation to continue. There is no doubt that the situation in the energy sector is shocking the economy and creating a state of emergency. And indeed, as in the case of what we have done in the financial sector, we must respond with the urgency and boldness dictated by the situation. Consequently, Mr. Speaker, government has resolved as follows: to convert all take-or-pay contracts to take-and-pay contracts. Accordingly, starting August 1st, 2019, government is to pay for energy and gas that we actually consume. All take-or-pay contracts will be renegotiated to convert to take-and-pay for both PPAs and gas supply agreements. Government will seek, of course, Mr. Speaker, parliamentary ratification where appropriate. We have resolved, Mr. Speaker, to suspend indefinitely or terminate all PPAs currently under negotiation, to immediately place a complete moratorium on signing new PPAs and put-call option agreements, to subject all future PPAs to competitive and transparent procurement procedures. Government will therefore no longer entertain any unsolicited proposals, to implement the economic merit order dispatch, which means that the most efficient power plants will be dispatched first, to improve the performance of the distribution utility, and we have agreed with the concessionaire a plan to reduce electricity losses and increase collections based on an agreed investment plan, to also significantly shift in the medium term the energy mix to gas and renewables, to implement the recommendation of the Economic Sector Recovery Program as approved by Cabinet, and to mandate the Energy Sector Task Force as constituted by Cabinet based on the recommendation in the ESRP to ensure and oversee the implementation of the Sector Recovery Program. Mr. Speaker, this will completely change our energy sector. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that government in 2017 issued the Energy Sector Levy Act, ESLA bond, which has to date raised almost 6 billion Ghana cedis on the back of ESLA levies to pay for legacy debts from the NDC's Dumsor days. The bond produced were used to liquidate approximately 60% of the energy sector legacy debts. Government proposes to increase the energy sector levy by 20 Ghana pesos per litre for petrol and diesel, and 8 pesos per kilogram for LPG, so as to increase the inflows to enable government issue additional bonds to pay down our energy sector debt obligations that we inherited from the NDC. Based on current indicated prices for petrol and diesel, this translates to Ghana pesos 90 Ghana pesos per gallon. In addition to the above, government is also taking steps to: 1. Relocate the car power ship to Takoradi to immediately utilize Sankofa gas. Increase power exports by extending the grid to other West African countries. Streamline management of street lighting to ensure accountability and transparency in billing and payments. Increase productive uses of electricity and natural gas to spur industrialization, and engage gas suppliers with a view to reducing the price of natural gas. Mr. Speaker, these new measures will build on the earlier ones we have already taken over the past 2.5 years, which include termination of the Quantum Gas project in 2017, termination of the Takoradi LNG projects, ADM with other one, WAGL, in the process of being terminated, renegotiation of the Ameri PPA in 2018 to reduce costs by 13%, renegotiation of the capacity charge under the Senate PPA, which has resulted in a 31% reduction in conversion of the PPA from take-or-pay to take-and-pay 2019, and deferment of 8 and termination of 2 PPAs in 2017. Mr. Speaker, with the additional measures we are introducing, we are going to clean up and sensitize energy sector, just as we have been doing in the financial services sector. These two sectors are fundamental to our agenda to grow the economy, create jobs, and bring prosperity to Ghanaians. Our government is strongly supportive of the private sector and believes in fostering a strong legal, regulatory, and enabling environment that supports private sector growth. However, we are not going to jeopardize our future through unbalanced contracts that benefit a few individuals and companies at the expense of the people of Ghana. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, as His Excellency the President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo said in his 61st Independence Day speech on Ghana Beyond Aid, and I quote, "We cannot subordinate the common good to build a prosperous nation to the selfish interests of a few." That is why this government has decided to convert all the take-or-pay contracts to take and pay. And in this policy orientation, Mr. Speaker, we are fully inspired by the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whose famous letter from a Birmingham jail reminds us, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality, Mr. Speaker, expressing the highest respect for law." Mr. Speaker, take-or-pay contracts will be a thing of the past in our country.